All right, everyone. So today we are going Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about transitional justice. I'm going to be starting in just a couple of minutes. Just have been trying to make sure that you all have proper access to everything that you need in order to enjoy the presentation. I want to make sure that I reiterate for everyone that at any point, if you have any questions, you simply just have to let me know. You can either send back questions in through either the actual Zoom call if you're on here, or you can send them through Facebook as well. And I will be monitoring both as I try and get my little setup set up to ensure that I am able to answer them. I want to thank y'all just in general for asking for certain topics. And although I do have certain topics that are set up specifically that we'll be doing, we obviously have the room up until election day to do literally any single topic. So if you're interested in a topic, it's definitely a good idea to suggest it. I don't mind doing the research, and this is obviously some really important work, and it's something that I can do, which is the reason why I am trying to do these series. All right, and so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about transitional justice. Transitional justice is also thought to be reparations. It includes reparations, but in an American context, more often than not, we're talking about transitional justice, we are talking about reparations. So now, there's my brief overview. So we're gonna be talking about it from different aspects. First, we're gonna talk about basically what is transitional justice on a very specific and broken down level. Then we're going to talk about why this matters in the United States. I think that sometimes we forget that because things have such a broad scope, they're implemented in different ways in different countries. And even in different states, sometimes you'll see large fluctuations when dealing with how to repair what the harm that's been done by systematic oppression. So we'll be talking about a US context for most of it. And we'll talk about the US's history of transitional justice. So what has been done, what hasn't been done, you know, what we've seen, what's in the works, because it's a very complex topic, especially whenever we're considering, you know, giving out large sums of money in order to fix the relationship between certain racial groups and the United States. So I figured basics, let's talk about what justice is. We talked about this briefly on, I believe, the second Deconstructing Systematic Racism presentation, but just a nice refresher is that justice is the maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards of punishment. That's a mouthful. Essentially, the idea is that justice is how we fix things or right wrongs. So whenever we're looking to do justice or have justice, we go about that by trying to find a system of balance. So it's assigning a reward or a punishment to an action or a claim that's been done against a person. Now, what is transitional justice? So transitional justice refers to the way countries emerging from periods of conflict and repression address large-scale or systematic human rights violations, so numerous and so serious that the normal justice system will not be able to provide an adequate response. So it's the idea of going essentially above our justice system or another level of our justice system. When you're dealing with an action that's been taken against an entire group of people, we're thinking about thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, large numbers. And the justice system is not built in a way to where we are talking about discussing one person's to a million people or a couple of 100,000 people's need for justice in relation to what's been done against them. As you just saw, most of our justice system and the definition of justice is repairing a harm against the individual or righting a wrong. Transitional justice elevates that and says we're going to right a wrong against a whole bunch of people. And our justice system is built to deal with sometimes groups. If you're familiar with class action lawsuits, then you know that very often we have, groups of anywhere from a couple to a few hundred people that may sue a company or a person in order to, again, repair the harm that was done to them or get adequate solutions for that harm that was done against them. But it's still not the scale of transitional justice. So just to make sure that we understand the difference between a couple people and we're talking about millions, possibly, or thousands or 100,000s. But it's a need to kind of bring it to a different level. Additionally, just so you guys know, like I've been doing in the last couple presentations, there is a QR code in the bottom right corner. This information comes from the International Center of Transitional Justice. I use quite a few sources for all my presentations, but some of the definitions that we're going to lay, just so you all understand the conversation, are from that place. And so you can scan the QR code in the bottom if you're watching on a computer or on a phone, or take a snapshot, import it into your photos, and you can read all of everything that they do and just in general about transitional justice on their website. They're a great resource. They talk about local and international transitional justice. So they talk about it not only in the US context, but in a worldly context, whether we're talking about especially like things like genocide, specifically even when it relates to like apartheid and different areas like that. So it's a great resource and I recommend it heavily. So transitional justice is rooted in accountability and redress for victims. It recognizes their dignity as citizens and as human beings. Ignoring massive abuses is an easy way out, but it destroys the values on which any decent society can be built. Transitional justice asks the most difficult questions imaginable about law and politics. So transitional justice, again, it's like trying to frame a format of how to help. How do we right our wrongs on a large scale and actively protect our citizens or just human beings? This doesn't have to just be citizen-oriented. We'll see in a little bit that some of the reparations in the history of the United States that have been given out have not been necessarily just to citizens. So it is something that, again, is super important to address, and it's such a broad topic, and trying to boil it down. By putting victims and their dignity first, it signals forward the way for a renewed commitment to make sure ordinary citizens are safe in their own countries. We want to protect citizens, we want to protect people and humans in their own countries, and we want to ensure that they're safe from the abuses of their own authorities and effectively protected from violations by others. If we don't protect the citizens of our own countries, it would be like allowing somebody to rob someone and never actually, holding the robber accountable, or, any related comparison you want to make, you could make about it. So, different areas of transitional justice. We've got four main areas. The main components are justice, so holding those most responsible for abuses legally accountable. Truth, which is giving survivors full accounting and acknowledgement of the abuses that occurred. Reparation, which is providing material and moral reparations to survivors. And non-recurrence, which is reforming the state institutions and strengthening civil society to ensure that the pattern of human rights abuse is not repeated. These can go hand in hand. They are not mutually exclusive. I think that it's especially important in considering how the United States in the past may have or may have not necessarily dealt with different aspects of these. The most common context that we're going to talk about today, like I said before, is reparations. So it's specifically dealing with the material goods and moral goods that are necessary in order to make sure that those survivors are adequately equated and are made right. And so there are different areas. I'll briefly talk about some non-recurrence that we've seen in the United States, but for the most part, depending on which group and which time period, a lot of these have never been fully fleshed out in a proper format, specifically by the United States. So justice can said to have been dealt with specifically for certain areas of people in certain places, but realistically, again, you can always argue that it hasn't been because we've not always adequately really dealt with these things. So moving on. Financial restitution. Now, this is directly related to reparations. Again, we're dealing with the money. We're dealing with the financial part of how you can help a victim in order to make sure that their life can be repaired for whatever harm that was done by, again, the institution that committed that harm. So their definition that was given to me, though, is in a traditional sense, a restitution has been defined as a monetary payment by the offender to the victim for the harm reasonably resulting from the offense. So, saying this is what was done, we're going to give you money that matches the harm that was committed in that action. It can be hard to quantify harm, but quantifying harm is really important when talking about righting or wrongs just in general, because you can, in a sense, quantify the effects of harm. You may not necessarily be able to quantify, say, like the personal specific impact of harm, but I mean, even in psychology, you realistically can, but it may be harder than doing it in a more broad sense. And so whenever you're quantifying harm, you can trace and say, okay, we see this thing happen to this group of people. This affected their children in this way. And we can see that this had a direct, specific reaction from what was done by, again, this entity. I think a lot of times these conversations we've been having recently, just about racism in general, people always say, don't compare, don't do this, don't do that. Don't try and minimize someone's harm by quantifying it, but you can quantify harm realistically. It can be done, and it's an essential part in having these conversations about reparations, which is why so many people don't necessarily believe that reparations should exist or that they do exist, because in their head, they're thinking that pain obviously went away because they're not doing the research to actually quantify how that's been affected. I could talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome in a little bit. It's not on the slides, but I think that'll be important in talking about the request for reparations in relation to Black Americans. So we've got, whoops, hold on one second, y'all. I'm gonna reload this because this is showing the wrong video. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, everyone, I am going to very quickly log back in and see why it is showing me an outdated version of the slides. Okay. There we go. Got something funky going on. So we're going to talk about first, before we move on to that, why people want reparations. Reparations, again, as I've said a couple different times, are to balance the scales. Whenever you are thinking of law, the most popular image that pops up is, Lady Liberty, that is, they're the woman holding the scales, who is blinded and holding the scales because it's a symbol of us trying to equate and get justice. And so that symbol is such an iconic symbol because a lot of what we do in law and just in general in relation to government is trying to balance the scales. And so reparations are a form of balancing the scales of what is happening. The goal is to try and kind of repair for systematic racism, structural racism, and the social racism that may have affected an individual group of people. It's about taking that systematic wrong and fixing it. So why do people want reparations? I realized whenever I started this series that I didn't do a specific series or a webinar in relation to exactly what systematic racism is versus other forms of racism. There are multiple forms of racism. It sounds like crazy to some folks and they're going to be like, what? There's multiple forms of racism? But yes, there are many, many forms of racism. And most of what we talk about here is systematic racism, especially in relation to reparations. But we have institutional racism, social racism, scientific racism, economic racism, cultural racism, national racism. Racism runs very deep in many different areas. And this is not even just on, again, on a US related scale, but all of these different forms of racism can apply to other countries. Countries where you have homogenous racial groups deal with some of these different areas. Like I said before, most of what we talk about is systematic racism, but these other areas of racism all intersect. And I'm gonna do, in 2 weeks, the next presentation will be just on the forms of racism. So we can actually dive deep into these, especially for those who may not understand exactly what they are. But I know for what the context today, again, mainly is talking about systematic racism. So America's systematic wrongs. America, obviously, as a growing and budding country, has dealt with multiple areas of systematic wrongs in different ways. They affect different groups in different ways, like I said before, not necessarily trying to quantify, but we have specific things that we know were done by our government, by the American aristocracy that affected different groups. And so Japanese folks, I will talk about, because Japanese internment that happened during World War II was a very, very big direct systematic wrong. Indigenous racism is so deep. Indigenous people, when you think about the fact they were the first people here in America before anybody else, their wrongs start so long ago, and they have such a impacted format now that we see of the effects of that. So I won't talk about all of Indigenous racism all of history, because that would be, again, like a whole nother presentation, but that is very important to the conversation. And we have Black racism, so Black American racism and murder. I use the term murder in relation to talk about these because there has been direct murder. With Indigenous folks, you can say that there was murder and genocide. With Black folks, we've definitely seen systematic murder due to governmental systems. And so that is really, again, essential in talking about that. So Japanese reparations. Japanese reparations deal a lot with internment. They deal entirely with what happened during World War II. So just for some pre-context, in World War II, Japanese people were rounded up as the US government was fighting and participating in the war. It started off because of the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan. And it was in December 7th, 1941. And that was the US's official entrance into World War II. And it really kind of pushed the US government into some more extremes when dealing with and talking about and handling Japanese Americans. We had Japanese immigrants that were here, we had Japanese citizens, you had second generation people that were from Japan, and they were all rounded up. 120,000 people or so, that number is debated. Depending on the site you look at, you'll see 127. Some sites say 121,000, some say 111,000, but based off of some of the most reputable sources, 120,000 is the most solid number. And they were held by the government in camps across the US. To round up people and put them in these camps is absolutely wild. Many people understand that's something that shouldn't have happened. Obviously, the government's response, though, was that they didn't trust their Japanese citizens anymore because of the Japan attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, they did get reparations. They're one of the few groups that have gotten reparations. Also, to kind of go back, 66,000 Japanese people that were put in internment camps out of the 120 or so thousand were citizens at that time. So they had, taken the oath, or they were born here, or something of that level to where they were, United States citizens. So this is not just the U.S. rounding up immigrants, immigrants that are, maybe undocumented or are not citizens yet. These are people who are citizens as well. So in 1988, the U.S. Did shell out reparations, or started the process for reparations for Japanese Americans. It was $1.6 billion, which is now equivalent to $3,460 million in 2019. And each individual Japanese citizen that was a resident immigrant was given $20,000. They were also given a presidential apology, and the president did a tour to kind of go and kind of try and redress what had happened and what had been done. This was done by Ronald Reagan, and it started off with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 in Congress. So they got checks. Checks were the format that were used. They were distributed from 1990 to 1993. And there was an amendment in 1993 that added $400 million extra dollars on top of that for different groups that hadn't been considered or thought of before, or the eligibility was unclear, so they may not have gotten the money that they were due. Out of all of that, 82,000 people ended up receiving this redress. So 82,000 Americans out of, think about it, 120,000 before that had been originally interned and rounded up. Now, I tried to look at the numbers as to how many people died before these were given out, and tried to kind of get a sense of that, but it was not the easiest thing to do, to get clear numbers on that. So this number is thought to include people who were still currently alive, who were reachable, who were in the US that qualified for that redress. Now, some politicians have said that reparations have never happened or that they're not relevant. And I've pulled a clip of our lovely Mitch McConnell just to kind of briefly show you some of the mindset that reparations don't happen, which again, as you've seen from me talking about this today, is very, very incorrect. Oops.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea. We've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president. I think we're always a work in progress in this country, but no one currently alive was responsible for that. And I don't think we should be trying to figure out how to compensate for it. First of all, it'd be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate. We've had waves of immigrants as well who've come to the country and experienced dramatic discrimination of one kind or another. So no, I don't think reparations are a good idea.
Now, you just saw the extreme minimization of the positive impact of reparations. People who received those reparations of Japanese descent previously in the time period were thought to have really exceeded and been grateful for what had happened, because it was necessary in order to say, hey, you were taken from your home. Japanese people lost some of their homes, they lost their valuables, certain things were never recovered. And so the US said, okay, here's this money that's important, even though not everybody in the government had anything to do with that. And so whenever you see stuff like this that basically is saying that reparations aren't necessary because the person that's involved didn't do them, it minimizes the impact long-term of those reparations. You also hear him mention things like having a Black president that kind of would make up for it. But the reason why I emphasized early on why there were so many different forms of reparations is because Black people have not gotten specifically, or really Indigenous people necessarily, financial reparations. And so in a sense, people have argued that having a Black president is a form of social reparations, so that they've been given kind of a social understanding that things have been eliminated from barriers and that it no longer exists, so it's not a problem to address. But the impact is longstanding. And as many people know, having 400 years of consistent discrimination, specifically for Black Americans, and I don't even know how many years you would say for Native Americans, but longer, is not something that you can just dismiss. But these are the arguments that you'll hear whenever people are disagreeing with reparations. And again, they tend to really stand on the fact that people now don't feel accountable because they feel like the effects have been minimized, but the effects have not. Really briefly, I guess here's a good place to talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is the idea that, in the same way we think of PTSD as having a long-standing effect, post-traumatic slave syndrome is having a long-standing effect on Black Americans who are descended from slaves. Post-traumatic slave syndrome was coined by Michelle Alexander, and there is an entire book on it. It's an absolutely great resource. I wish I should have linked that, but Michelle Alexander, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And it talks about how these effects have affected the literal genealogy of Black Americans. Studies have been done to similar groups as well. Some Latino Americans have had studies done on that as well, and there's some proof of that, as well as in Native Americans. And so the trauma is very literally being passed down from group to group, from generation to generation. And it's not something clearly that has just dissipated, because it's a part of the actual DNA and the functioning. Again, we can talk about this. I think it will be good in 2 weeks to really address post-traumatic slave. I think it's post-traumatic slave disorder or syndrome. It's two different ways people talk about it. And I'll include that as well in the next discussion that I do. But this is one example of somebody talking about how it hasn't really happened very much and how they don't really see the use in it. Now, Native Americans. Native Americans, if you look it up, you'll think that, yes, they got reparations. It's been said that they did, but that's extremely incorrect. I don't think I have to explain why Native Americans deserve reparations or why it's a necessity in order to repair the harm done. But in case you're unfamiliar, Native Americans were colonized. They had heavy genocide done. There was seizure of lands, mass murder, just a lot of different things that were done to that group and that intrinsically have disadvantaged them forever. Native Americans had never gotten all of their land back that was taken. A lot of that land is now colonized by people. It's been bought up. It belongs to the government partially. And so they've never gotten those original land ownings back, which is really, 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 again, important where we're talking about something that belonged to somebody and it was seized entirely by the United States and by citizens and never given fully back. Now, reparations were never fully received by the Native populations. So the way that the US government decided to structure it was they decided that they were going to give out money to each of the individual, tribes and bands, and then the tribes and bands would redistribute that to their own citizens. 1.3 billion was said to be distributed to tribes and bands. Different groups, right, might need different amounts, but essentially they decided overall that 1.3 billion total would be enough. And mind you, this was in, what year was this in? This was in the 1950s. So in 1946, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission, and that was decided to cry and hear the historic grievances and become and what Native Americans should receive. Again, 1946. So, and just kind of giving some more context, Native Americans, even after being colonized, having the land stolen, were some of the biggest contributors for World War II, and they were affected at World War II at an extremely high disproportionate rate. So 13% of the entire Native American population at the time served as code talkers and helped with their tribal languages in order to help the US win in World War II. So as you see, World War II has such a deep connection to most of these conversations we'll have. You can really see so much of what happened in the country now kind of rippled by the effects of World War II one way or another. So this was a big thing. And so this is kind of what started some conversation of people saying, hey, this population has given such a big contribution to us after we've come in, we've stolen their land, we've done these things, yet they still have never actually been given any sort of formal apology and formal restitution or reparation for what happened. And so Indian Claims Commission decided to, create this number, create these ideas. It ended up boiling down though to only $1,000 per person. Not very much. As you think about what $1,000 would have been worth in that time period, and now, I think with inflation, it'd only still be, like $3,000 per person? And that's total. So that would be entirely what they get. There wouldn't be any extra. That's solid $1,000 or $3,000 modern per person with no other changes. Now this money was taken and they agreed on it and the money was supposed to be shelled out, but it was put into trust accounts by the United States government and never fully disseminated to the populations. Small bits were disseminated to certain populations of certain Native populations, but even the numbers are extremely low for what should have been given out. And there's never been a real formal apology for Native Americans for the colonization, the genocide, the seizure of lands, any of it. And so Native Americans have reparations in progress, but again, it's now 2020. And this started in 1940. And so if we're thinking about the time period and how long that's been delayed, it's something to kind of talk about because they've still to this day have not formally given out that money, and that money is still held up in trust. Now there is some discrepancy because the money has said to have been used by the government for other purposes as well. So some of the money is thought to even not even be there. like it should be, to actually go back and still redistribute it now. Going on to Black Americans. So again, this is just very brief overview of what has happened historically to kind of make people think that there should be reparations. So you've got slavery, where we should all be relatively aware of the impacts of slavery and what happened. Then even after slavery, you had lynching. Some of that was run by the US government. And if not by the government, by people in positions of power that were related, such as like police officer chiefs, state police officers, even governors that participated in making sure that the KKK was upheld. You've got systematic racism, as I briefly talked about, and incarceration. And just to kind of make a point, slavery still exists today. People tend to not really understand that, because when you said that, they're like, what? But the Emancipation Proclamation did clear up that time period slavery as we know it, but slavery was then reinstituted as a possible result of crime committed as the 13th Amendment. So that 13th Amendment still allows slavery to exist today, just for some context. Now, Black people were promised reparations after emancipation. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, there were many conversations that happened, and they were promised some form of reparations. The biggest thing that you hear is 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule is actually fascinating because it comes from, I believe, in Virginia, where they decided to, it comes from Congress, whenever they were discussing with Lincoln how to give reparations to Black Americans. And the idea was that for certain colonies that were colonized from slavery, specifically like Panama, is that they would be given 40 acres and a mule. Then the mule kind of referred to a job. So giving them a job that was sustainable in the, what is it called, industry? In the coal industry, would have been their idea of reparations. There was a lot of land that had been available. And so the idea was kind of just to give that because it was simple, it could be done quickly. And that was in 1862. Now, Congress approved $600,000 to fund Lincoln's plan. And it was to move Black people more to those islands as well. And part of that pull was heightened by saying, hey, you move here, we're going to give you 40 acres and a job. And they approved that initially, and they gave him the powers to orchestrate that. So then he created the Immigration Office with the Department of Interior and tried to look for suitable land. So that's the idea of when you hear people saying that they were owed 40 acres and a mule, it was a project essentially run by Lincoln to say, rather than having Black people all over the place, we're going to put them in an area and give them all this land in this area to kind of try and repair for the harm of slavery that we've done. And again, this is Panama that we're thinking of mainly. And at that point, it was a part of Gran Colombia. Now, the idea of a land grab actually still exists today. Land reparations or property reparations, I guess you could call them, are given in other countries. And we've seen some of that in the US. Like I said previously, some Native populations were given back their own land as a form of land reparations. And if you think about this, trying to essentially move an entire population of people somewhere else to get them settled seems kind of complicated. It's one of the reasons why it necessarily didn't work out. And also that would still be a form of recolonization because you're taking people and moving other people from an island that may have already been there, have already been getting on their feet to try and help Black Americans. So again, complex, very confusing. So when people hear this term 40 acres and a mule, it is real, and that is what Black Americans are promised. It's just what it got wrapped up in was a little bit complicated. And then also additionally, Thomas Jefferson proposed a grant of 50 acres to any free man who didn't have at least that much whenever he was drafting the Constitution for Virginia in 1776. And that was obviously not to Black Americans, but to other Americans. But that was a proposal. And we've seen a couple other proposals over time that deal with this land. There was even an act passed in 1862 to 1916, which gave 640 acres to different groups of Americans as well. And again, you're thinking 160 acres, a lot of land comparing to the 40 acres that were initially promised. Regardless, reparations have never been formally given by the US government for Black slave-descended Americans. There have been conversations, as we've seen. There were kind of scattered promises made, but in terms of it formally occurring, it has not formally occurred. And that is why there's such a push now for Black Americans to get reparations. Now, again, some people don't think reparations are important. If you look at wealth distribution amongst Black and white Americans in the US, it's extremely disparaging. So for amongst any education level, and this was done by the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, you see that for people that have less than high school, typically will have $1,500, it'd be worth $1,500 that are Black. High school graduates will typically worth $3,200. People with some college that are Black will be worth $7,000, while people with a college degree will be worth $23,000 or so that are Black. Post-college is around $84,000. Now, if you go look at the white distribution numbers, already starting off, white people with less than high school are already valued at $34,000. And that's a jump from $1,500 to $34,000. Then you have for high school graduates, $3,200 compared to $78,000. You have some college, $7,000 to $86,000. A college degree going from $23,000 to $180,000. And post-college going from $84,000 to $293,000. A lot of numbers. As you can see, that's a big number jump. And so it shows that regardless of the education level of Black Americans, there is still a extreme disproportionate distribution of the wealth because of, again, going back to slavery and the many disadvantages that were a part of the system as a part of that. I can also do a whole talk on slavery separately and just kind of the effects of that. I think that'll be necessary because, as you see, it's major. But just so you guys understand the context, looking at the numbers and the fact that even Black people with degrees are a third likely to make as much money as a white American with the same post-college degree. Now, Cory Booker kind of very briefly wrapped this up in a way that was great whenever he was testifying and talked about kind of why reparations matter for Black Americans. Whoops.
And I feel a sense of anger where we are in the United States of America, where we have not had direct conversations about a lot of the root causes of the inequities and the pain and the hurt manifested in economic disparities, manifested in health disparities, manifested in a criminal justice system that is indeed a form of new Jim Crow. And so we as a nation have not yet truly acknowledged and grappled with racism and white supremacy that has tainted this country's founding and continues to persist in those deep racial disparities and inequalities today. This is a very important hearing. It is historic. It is urgent.
Asked me 4 years ago if I thought that we would ever talk about reparations, I would have probably laughed because, it was never taken seriously at least. But now, there's a lot of new fresh faces in the Congress. There's a lot of power, and I think it's great that we have adequate representation to have the conversation. I think that it makes it a little bit more, hopeful that, something will be done because we do have more African Americans in Congress. So, yeah.
And so that's just, kind of part of the personal sentiment and discussion. There are new bills that have come up recently in regards to reparations. I'll talk about a couple of them briefly, or one of them briefly. But it's the idea, again, as you heard him talking about, kind of to fix that and go back and give it a real chance. Because the formal request for reparations initially has been a conversation that's happened, but we haven't seen committees established like we saw with Native American committees, even though that committee, again, was largely ignored because, again, Native American people have never gotten the reparations that they were already set aside to get. But trying to start that process is something to discuss. So, current bill that everybody's been talking about, it's been all over the place. I also want to plug, this website is free. I explain to people constantly, it's so easy to get information on Congress. Most of what is going on you can find publicly. Everything has to be documented because it's just, necessary for a public entity like that. And so this is called BillTrack. I think it's billtrack.gov that you can go to look up any bill in all of history of Congress, and where it is, or if it got passed, if it was, introduced, and kind of, who introduced it, all of that type of information. This is the most current reparations related bill. It was recommended by, or presented, sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas, and it was introduced in January of 2019. It has only been introduced, which means that it is currently sitting in a committee, waiting for the committee to deliberate, and the committee may or may not pass it on. A lot of people don't know you can introduce a bill, and just because you introduce it doesn't mean anything. The bill can just be stuck in a committee forever until it's just disregarded and discarded. And so this was introduced last year. There were actions taken on it in 2019 of June, and I think this has been reintroduced this year again. I'll try and get the current information. But this is the most recent bill that I was able to pull up for this about reparations. The description of the bill is that the bill establishes the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and in the United States from 1619 to present and recommended appropriate remedies. Among other requirements, the commission shall identify 1, the role of federal state government in supporting the institution of slavery, 2, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and 3, lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans in society. A lot of mouthful, but the description of the bill, it says exactly that. This is exactly why it's necessary and kind of what should be happening. Again, this is still stuck in a committee, has not passed anywhere. It has not gone for a vote officially on the floor. And so people are getting frustrated because even if you look at this, I forgot his name, but he introduced a bill every single year for like the last 20 or 30 years for reparations. And he does it every single year. He's no longer in Congress anymore, which is the reason why Sheila Jackson Lee has kind of taken over that. And she has promised to introduce a bill like this every single year. And so we'll kind of see where that goes. But just so people know, it is something that has been proposed. So it's not like this crazy concept that is intangible. It's something we've seen happen, and it's something that people have proposed to try and get to continue to happen. But like most things in politics, it works really slowly. And like I just said, people don't think that reparations happen. I've heard so many times while trying to do this that like, we've never done that before, we've never done that before. As I already showed you, we've already seen that Japanese reparations were given, done, completed, and finished by the US government, handled fairly quickly. If you look at the comparison between the struggle for Black reparations and for Indigenous reparations. Reparations have occurred in places like South Africa in regards to apartheid, and we've seen them in other places that have had genocides happen in other parts of Africa. We've seen them happen, for example, in Germany. There are reparations done in Germany for Jewish Americans, and reparations done in just all places all over the globe. Now, the biggest thing is how they're done may differ, and what format they come in is what we also see differ as well. So, like, just to go back and kind of explain, some of the reparations that we see sometimes may be in regards to saying, hey, we are going to institute a mandatory information for everyone to learn about this event and to make sure that it is a part of every history book ever, and we're never going to ignore it. That happened with Jewish reparations. And so if you go and learn about anything in Germany, you will have to learn about the Holocaust in a deep and effective and in-depth way. There's no way that you go through school and you don't learn about the Holocaust, because part of the reparations were promising to implement that into some of the education. We don't really have any sort of educational promises like that besides when dealing with the Holocaust for America. Even Japanese internment isn't taught properly in a lot of schools as it should be, aside from college, and even then, college is by choosing your own classes. So it's not really a part of any mandatory education. Indigenous struggles in past and history are really not taught thoroughly. We learn a little bit about, Indigenous history, depending on your high school and the adequacy of your teacher on the subject matter. You may learn a lot or a little, but again, there's no formalized reparations that are towards educational agency in the United States that deal with really dealing with and talking about the history of these topics on an in-depth and comparable level. So just in general, little overview. I know I talked about this kind of briefly, but actually might come back to this. We're going to come back to this. So some book resources. I didn't recommend a whole bunch of books this week because there are thousands of books on reparations, like literally thousands. And I want to adequately go through all of them myself. I try and make sure before I recommend books to you all that I've read some, if not most, if not all of it, so I can adequately recommend it. This is a really good book to kind of start talking about reparations for Black Americans specifically, in the context that we're kind of looking at From Here to Equality. It's written by William A. Darty Jr. and Kirsten Mullen. Really, 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 really great educators. They also have been doing like panels and stuff on the book and like going over, you know, different aspects of it. But this is specifically related to Black Americans. If you go Google reparations and you Google United States reparations, you're going to find hundreds of thousands of books. And so while I recommend this book specifically because that's what I've looked at, there's no shortage of resources. And I'm more than happy to link anybody to any books if they want ones on specific areas. There are books on Indigenous reparations, but they tend to be related to other historical contexts. And so this is one of the few books I found that was purely reparations, talking about the context that we're talking about, and in relation specifically to Black Americans. Again, hundreds of thousands of books on the internet. You can look them up on Google Scholar. If you're a college student, if you're not, I'm still pretty sure that they have lots of free options, or, you know, options where you can purchase the book as well. And so this is one of those recommendations that I did have specifically. Now, let me go back and talk about the upcoming talks that I'll be having. So, like I said before, I didn't do an introductory webinar about systematic and institutional racism. It's something that just at the time, I didn't know this was going to become a series. So when I did defunding the police, I wasn't sure I was going to do it this long and like this, but now that it's become a consistent thing, I think it's really important to kind of lay some groundwork for those of you who watch consistently to talk about systematic and institutional racism. Talking about it is going to require a lot. Like I showed you earlier, we have so many different types of racism that people don't even think about or know about. And so kind of distinguishing what is systematic racism versus social racism. How are they different? Why are they different? And, you know, just in general, what we can learn from them. Because like I said, they're very, very, very different topics. And if you don't understand that, then whenever I'm saying this is systematic or this is institutional or this is social or whatever else it may be, you're not going to really be able to follow along. So like all of my calls, this will be free. You can join on here, however you're joining now. I always do these now on Instagram and on Facebook and on Zoom. And whichever format you choose is up to you. And then in 2 weeks from now, let me move this for the Instagram folks. I'm going to be talking about standardized testing. People do not know standardized testing is rooted in racism. The creation of standardized testing in the United States was for the purpose of a eugenics purpose, trying to separate and kind of control which groups could get into where. Obviously, it's rooted in white supremacy, like most things are that are like that. But it's as people start kind of canceling standardized testing, I've seen a lot of people stressing, why does it matter? You know, how does standardized testing hurt anybody? You know, it's just a test, you can take it. Why do Black students sometimes do well? Why do Asian students sometimes do well? Why do Latino students sometimes do well if it's rooted in racism and if it's, you know, really not something we should be using to utilize value? And there's just so much about it. So I'm really excited about that one. If you have questions ahead of time, like always, you can submit them to me and I'll try and make sure that I address it in the presentation. But it's going to be a good conversation, especially as people start going back to school. And again, as we're seeing these colleges all over the place eliminate their standardized testing as an entrance format and kind of looking at more holistic views. I'll probably also talk about people being colorblind in job applications as well in it, because the idea of being colorblind isn't actually helpful. There are multiple studies that have proven that trying to do colorblind resumes actually can lead to more bias because there's always something, right? There's schools, you know, there's the way a name sounds, there's, you know, where people grew up, their neighborhoods, where they've worked. And so I'll probably address all of that as well. Now, if you want to, you can see all of my information and the dates. I'll be scheduling the majority of the rest of these on my website, so you'll be able to see all the upcoming topics. Right now, I just have like this one up, but I'll have probably for the rest of until November, every topic up that we'll be covering. And so you can go there, you can register, make sure that you get a spot in my call, and make sure that you get your questions answered if it's not something I'm already discussing. Last but not least, we have resources. Like always, I'll email these to anybody who asks for them, but these are the main resources I used in order to kind of talk about this discussion and to look at the context. I really want to just offer any information I can. And so I try and use at least 10 sources every time I look up anything. So that way it's something that anybody can find. And so I want to thank you all for coming on today. If you would like to learn more, like I said, you can go to theabiola.com or you can send me a message. Feel free to comment on this video as it's up. It'll be left up on both my Facebook and my Instagram pages. And thank you all for joining. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye. Whoops.